Hello, I'm Michael Jackson, General Manager of Public Health, Venture Capital, and Startups here at Amazon Web Services. And I'd like to welcome you to reInvent 2020, specifically to our We Power Tech session entitled Closing the Digital Divide with Accessible Technology. From a national perspective, and even globally, the definition of minority is changing. There's no disputing that. In fact, according to census data, the U.S. will become a majority-minority nation by 2045. Today's racial minorities will be the primary source of growth in the nation's youth and working-age populations. Most of the growth will come from this group as it relates to the future of our voting electorate and the growth in it. And much of the growth in our nation's consumers and tax base will also be spurred by our racial minorities as far into the future as we can see. This suggests the necessity for continued investments in our diverse youth and young adults as the general population continues to age. However, in too many cases, the underrepresentation of many of these groups persists, particularly in technology. And since it's technology that continues to bring our world closer together, it's imperative that we understand its relationship with building and maintaining an inclusive environment for everyone. That's just part of what we're going to discuss in today's Lightning Talk, and I'm very excited to welcome my two esteemed panelists, Angelina Howard, a fellow Amazonian, as well as Nichelle Sanders from a dynamic organization called Afropunk. So what I'll do first is ask them to tell a little bit more about their background and the current roles in their organizations, and we're going to start off with Nichelle.
Well, my name is Nichelle Sanders. Just want to say, first of all, thanks to the We Power Tech team who invited me here, as well as the Amazon team in general for having me at this talk. I'm currently strategic advisor at Afropunk. I've been involved with the organization for many years. We're a global community that represents Black creativity and excellence in all of its forms while eschewing all systems of racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, fatphobia, and above all, with no hatefulness. So we encompass a global community of Black creators and tastemakers that have moved culture and society in both creative and political ways. We actually started as a very specific message board within the punk scene about 15 years ago. And over time, we've become known for our music festivals, which have appeared in like New York, Atlanta, London, Paris, Johannesburg, and Bahia, Brazil. And, you know, that sort of kernel of community that we created in the punk scene just sort of became a larger metaphor for Black people being able to exist in all of their many facets. So I'm super excited to have a conversation about intersectionality, because I think it's super important to freedom and to becoming the highest version of yourself, which is what, you know, Afropunk is all about. So can't wait to dive in.
Well, welcome. We look forward to hearing your perspective. Angelina, how about you give us the same background on yourself as well as your current role in the organization?
Sure. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. My name is Angelina Howard. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am a fellow Amazonian with Michael. I've been at the company for 6 years. I am a senior product manager on our digital software and video games team. I lead the customer discovery if you are shopping for a video game, which I'm sure a lot of you have since it is new next generation time. So all the Xboxes and PlayStation 4s, for example, it was my job to make sure that you could get that without the veto page or product page going down, which I would say was very successful. So that is my job, is really looking at the customer journey as you're shopping for different things on the site. In addition to that, I am the president of Amazon's Black Employee Network, or you may hear it referred to as BEN. I've been the president for the last, almost 2 years now. And before that, I was networking director. BEN is focused on creating a sense of community and really driving to help Amazon become a more inclusive company. And I always say inclusive first instead of diverse, because we have to make sure that it's a company that is first inclusive. People feel comfortable being there. Because if you do that, you do diversity first, people will not stay. So I'm always pushing for inclusivity, and I'm happy to be on this panel. It's something that I strive for within my role within BIN, but also as a product manager. I view it as my duty to make sure that I am not pushing out products that aren't inclusive. So making sure that I'm educating myself. So I educate my engineers, UX teams. It is the product owner's job to make sure they're putting in the right requirements and reviewing the product before it goes out. So I'm excited to talk about that more on this panel, and I'm excited to get started.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Angelina. And in that vein, I think we're going to continue down that path since, as you said, you are a fellow Amazonian. You know as well as everyone or many on the call here that across all of our Amazon companies, employees embody 14 leadership principles. One of those is customer obsession, which speaks to how we work backwards from the customer. In fact, over 90% of our services and products are the direct result of influence and input that we receive through feedback from our customers. So, in that context, from your perspectives, what does an inclusive tech future look like where all stakeholders are customer obsessed? We'll start with you this time, Angelina.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot is how do we make sure that we're building inclusive products? And like I said before, as a product manager, I really feel like that is my job. And when you're building the requirements at the beginning, how do we make sure that we're not pushing things out and then, retroactively saying, oh my gosh, this didn't work out? How do we make sure we're building products that are for the customers we have today, but also thinking further ahead as to what customers do we not have and why not? So an example that I'm doing is thinking through my stakeholders is not just the current customers that we have, but also thinking about the customers that we could have. But also I think sometimes we don't view our customers as fellow employees. How can I make sure that I'm building a product that my fellow employees could use? How do I make sure I'm building a product that our current customers can use? And how can I make sure that I'm building a product that we're able to drive and get more? So I do talk to my team a lot about how can we make sure that when we're doing the design phase, the planning phase for that we're building it at the beginning. And I think that a lot of companies have to start to think about too is what products have you already launched that you can go back and make more inclusive. So I think about it in a sense of being proactive and really expanding what you're viewing as your customers. And that's how you really start to build a more inclusive tech future.
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I mentioned in my current role as general manager for venture capital and startups, specifically focused on public health, I see a lot of disparities as it relates to access to resources. So not only should we be inclusive, in my opinion, understanding that the products and solutions that we make should be reflective of the customers that we serve, but the delivery of that technology should be reflective. Access to resources to create the technology, whether it's capital or mentorship, etc. I think throughout that whole life cycle, as you said, should be reflective of that inclusion that will be baked in as the technology is consumed. So on that vein, Nichelle, I'll turn to you. From your perspective, what does an inclusive tech future look like when everyone adopts a similar customer obsession and it's reflective across the board?
I think the idea of customer obsession is really interesting in the sense of, it being an invitation to get to know people beyond sort of their transactional behavior and really getting to know people as people. Some you guys might relate to this. I would say a lot of people of color, for instance, feel like, one of the things about being a person of color is that you don't get seen as an individual. All the things that make up who you are not necessarily seen. And you get lumped into buckets very easily. But I feel like because, technology is basically completely overlaid culture at this point, we're sort of beyond the situation where, technology sort of sits in any corner or in any vertical or any realm. Technology really overlays the entirety of society at this point. So I think it's really incumbent on us to think of technology in the way that we think of society. Like, in the ways that we think, what kind of country do we want? That has to do with technology. What kind of education do we want? What kind of culture do we want? What kind of schools do we want? What kind of healthcare, to your point, do we want? So I think it's at the point where if we don't think about it inclusively, we're not even thinking about technology. We're almost abdicating the thought of technology because basically technology has become so big that, until you really see each individual for who they are in a really deep and textured way, it's going to be really hard to create, further innovation or breakthroughs in technology. So I think, the sort of the customer obsession that you're talking about must happen, because I think we've sort of probably gone as far as we can with heuristics. Like, we have to get beyond really broad archetypes, because I think, that's sort of where we are now. And the future is really about, who are people at their core, at their most, basic elements, and, understanding all of those layered elements that make up people.
So speaking of layers, I'd like to peel back one layer because you touched on something that I think is really important just now, Nichelle. You mentioned technology's impact on society, and it would be an understatement to say that 2020 so far has been a challenging year, right? I mean, so far we've seen a global pandemic, we've seen renewed calls for social justice, a contested presidential election. Just over the past couple weeks, we've seen deaths exceeding 1,000 per day in this country as a result of the coronavirus. So, with that in mind, I guess my question is, in your experience, how can tech be used to effectively identify and address prioritized social issues that affect our community? And so, just really quickly, through the lens of public health, I will say that it's no secret that from the very beginning, this pandemic has impacted various populations very differently. For example, disproportionately impacting people of color. It's disproportionately impacted those who are in rural areas with a lack of access. So, with that in mind, again, I'll pose the question starting with you, Nichelle. How can we leverage technology to identify and address some of those issues?
I think coming through the lens of Afropunk, and thinking about our community growing over the last 15 years, basically starting with an online message board. So I think with the ubiquity of technology now, it's a really amazing way to sort of allow people to self-identify and to self-sort into communities and conversations that are relevant to them. I think empowering people to tell their own stories and share their own lived experiences. I think, when you're talking about the impact of, for instance, what's happened in 2020 with COVID, like if you think about the narratives that have happened around COVID, where people who, let's say, were only seeing what was happening through the view of news or through a mediated channel versus people who were, having the lived experience of either having COVID or knowing people who've had COVID. I think technology from an identification standpoint allows people to really seamlessly and immediately share stories. So, instead of relying on other people to transmit and curate information, we do have that opportunity. I mean, I think obviously we've seen the downsides of that, with people putting out information that's not true, et cetera. But I think creating a culture that, elevates the power of that and creating cultural norms around the power of that can be a really amazing way to, sort of allow technology through people to identify communities and experiences that may need help, allowing people to raise their hand for aid, whether that's, emotional aid, material aid, whatever that is. Technology does a great job of putting people together that may not be together in time and space. But I think it's also, understanding that there is a flip side of that in terms of, when you identify people around social issues, like if you're, bucketing them in with things that might not be seen as, a positive attribute, really having the foresight to understand that there could be unintended consequences to that and thinking through, all of those eventualities. So I think, from a very top line perspective, technology is a really powerful tool. And like any powerful tool, it has to have, norms and rules around its operation. So I think, that's super important, especially when you're talking about communities that have been historically underrepresented or underempowered.
Sure. All right, and Angelina, I think you bring a different perspective to this. So, in your opinion, how can technology, same question, be used to identify and address social issues that address our communities?
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what Nichelle said. I think technology has allowed us to be able to spread news faster. So I think we think about social media, and I think it has its pros and its cons, right? Where you have people who are, sending out fake news. But you're also able to highlight things that are happening around the world. So you think about, the End SARS movement. I would have never known that being in America, but now I see what is happening in Nigeria and other countries in Africa, and how can we support them. So I think about technology in one way of just being able to spread knowledge across, different continents even. I think that to me is just so powerful, and it's sharing news, but also sharing information. I've been able to learn more about voter suppression this year than I have anywhere, anytime. And I think a lot of that is not just from, just reading articles, but you're able to see what is actually happening in other states, and how can you use your platform and your voice. And that's what I've done. As the president of Ben, I'm like, how can we make sure that we are seeing these things? And how can we make sure that our leaders see this and that we're educating all of our employees about what's going on and how we can better prevent it, or at least make sure that we're prepared for different things. We think about voting, we think about the impacts of COVID. How can we raise our hands and say, hey, we see what's happening in our neighborhoods. How can we do something about that? So I think about it and how can we spread news. But I think also the way that we can react to things. So when we find out about how COVID is impacting, you hear a lot of buildings, they're closed, but some buildings, for example, Amazon has retrofitted them so that we can be able to check people's temperatures. So we're seeing technology really move faster, and how can we do things that, people may have to still go to work in day to days, but how can we speed up testing? How can we get resource people faster? We think about people who are in rural areas. How are we able to get these supplies to them? And I think that goes beyond just COVID. How can we make sure that people who are living in food deserts have access to food? And I see technology doing that. People may not be able to drive to near cities, so what are the alternatives for them? So I see technology really solving the problems that we typically weren't able to talk about as freely, or maybe couldn't move as quickly. And that's what I'm really excited for. And in my role, again, as the president of Ben, when I see problems, I raise them. How can we use our technology that we have at Amazon to better serve people? And then as a product manager, how can I use it's my responsibility. How can I look at what I have access to make things better for people? So I think about it in that way of just, how to use your platform, your roles, whatever it is, to also make life better, the community better, the world better. And that's how I view our social responsibility there.
Very, very well said. I'll give you just a nugget. I mentioned my current role is GM of venture capital and startups as it relates to public health. But up until recently, I had established and I was leading two of our industry businesses in state and local government. And Angelina, you touched on aspects of each, right? Public health in the middle of a pandemic. And so I can tell you that as states were starting to open up a couple months ago before this third wave hit us, what we found was that individuals who were more likely to be exposed were those who are quote unquote essential workers, for example. They had an increased risk of exposure, which led to an increased risk of infection, which then ultimately led to an increased rate of mortality. So in addition to having the pandemic disproportionately impact people of color, we found that many people of color were also disproportionately reflected in those service industries. And so what we did is we worked through partners and with our state and local customers to build solutions to help those essential workers, for example, find credentialed, certified childcare. Or in the way of elections, we worked with a number of states across the country to help with what we call omni-channel voter engagement. To your point, because everybody has different needs to receive information, different preferred channels to receive information, but regardless, the information should be no less accurate, immersive, intuitive, and secure. So, for example, some people who may have certain disabilities may look to an Alexa device versus a web browser to get that information. So I couldn't agree with you more. So I think we can all agree that a major component of inclusion is belonging. And that brings us to intersectionality, which is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorizations like race, class, religion, gender, disability, sexual orientation, age, veteran status, and a lot more. You could even argue that we can't fully achieve a sense of belonging until we are each accepted or even encouraged to celebrate every single aspect of who we are. So, with this being the final question, let's make this the lightning round of our lightning talk. And I'll pose this question to each of you. What role would you say that intersectionality plays in the future of technology? So, Angelina, let's throw it to you first.
Sure. I always love thinking and talking about intersectionality because I think it's important. Oftentimes, I think a lot of people think about diversity and they are very one dimensional, and no one is one dimensional. So I would say that that's where intersectionality plays, is making sure that we're being mindful that, someone may look at me and say, like, oh, like, what are you first? I always say that I'm Black first, but I'm a Black woman. But there's also things that you can't see about me that you may not know. So I think that can be things as far as disabilities, that's intersectional. How do you think about those type of things as you're building out products for the future? So that's just the thing that I would say is important, is when we think about intersectionality, is being mindful and intentional and recognizing that people are not one-dimensional, your customers are not one-dimensional, and building products that reflect that.
Absolutely. As a Black male veteran Amazonian, I couldn't agree more. Now, Nichelle, how would you handle that question? What role would you say that intersectionality plays in the future of technology?
I think it's pretty simple. I mean, for me, intersectionality is the future of technology. You can't, I mean, in terms of, unless you want to be sort of a solution hunting for a problem, address people's real issues, address people's real identities, address people's real lives. And then, beyond intersectionality being the future of technology, it's the opportunity. It's the next everything. So I think it's such a fertile ground for creation.
Fertile ground for creation. That is a beautiful final thought. And because we're going to have to pause it for now. And I say pause it because the conversation will continue. I'd like to thank both of my panelists, Nichelle and Angelina, and for all of you who joined us today for today's session. But the conversation will continue on December 4th on the Ben Black Employee Network Twitch channel. We will dive even deeper into this topic, closing the digital divide with accessible technology. I hope to see you there. Thank you both again for your time.